The morning sun slanted through stained glass windows, casting broken colors across the polished floor of Magnolia County Courthouse. The janitor moved like a shadow among chatter and echoes, his mop sliding with rhythm against marble that had heard a century of lies. The courtroom brimmed with restless energy, lawyers whispering, jurors yawning, and the old judge flipping through notes she wouldn't need. When the bailiff tripped on a loose cable and sent his clipboard flying, the room burst into laughter, the kind that releases tension before something greater breaks. Amid the chuckles, Elias Ward didn't smile. His eyes traced the bench where verdicts had long been bought with power, where men like him had been erased by signatures. The laughter swelled again as the judge dabbed her eyes, joking about needing a janitor to clean up the chaos. That's when Elias set his mop aside, straightened his spine, and walked, slowly, deliberately, toward the bench. Silence crawled back into the room as every laugh turned to breathless disbelief. The janitor was climbing the steps to the judge's seat. The silence that followed felt alive, heavy as judgment itself. Every eye fixed on the janitor, who now sat behind the bench, hands resting calmly on the gavel's base. Judge Crane's laughter dissolved into confusion, her voice faltering as she demanded to know what he thought he was doing. But Elias didn't answer her. Not yet. He studied the courtroom like a doctor diagnosing a wound too deep to suture. "All rise," he murmured, his tone not loud but commanding enough to send a chill through the air. The bailiff froze mid-step. The prosecutor's smirk collapsed into disbelief, and the jurors slowly stood as if bound by invisible strings. Even the judge hesitated, caught between outrage and a strange, unspoken respect. In that breathless stillness, Elias leaned forward and whispered, "Let's see if justice can finally stand on her own." Judge Crane found her voice again, brittle and trembling, demanding security, but the bailiff hesitated, his eyes on Elias, as if uncertain who truly commanded authority. The crowd murmured, the echo of laughter now replaced by the pulse of fear. Elias's voice cut through the tension, low but carrying. "You've all judged men without knowing their truth. Today you'll hear mine." Clara leaned forward, heart pounding, sensing that something far greater than an outburst was unfolding. The prosecutor scoffed, calling for order, but the words fell dead in the room's thick air. Elias's eyes locked with the judge's, and for a moment, the years between them, the trial that broke him, the decision that destroyed his name, flickered like ghosts across their faces. "You remember me?" he said quietly, and in the hush that followed, her silence was its own confession. The crowd erupted, whispers crashing like a storm. The janitor knew the judge. Reporters fumbled for recorders. Jurors exchanged wild glances, and even the bailiff stepped back, uncertain whether to intervene. Elias rose from the chair and walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, his boots echoing on the marble. 20 years ago, he said, his voice trembling with restrained fire, a man named Elias Ward was accused of falsifying evidence in a case he tried to save an innocent boy. That man lost his license, his home, his name. He paused, staring into the faces that once mocked him. "He became your janitor." The room fell utterly still. Clara's hand shook as she wrote the words. Judge Crane's lips parted, the truth clawing its way through the years of denial. Judge Crane's voice softened. A faint trace of the woman she once was before ambition hardened her edges. "Elias, I thought you left," she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "No, Judge, I stayed." Someone had to clean what was left behind. The irony landed heavy, the janitor cleaning the mess of justice itself. Prosecutor Hurst stepped forward, his arrogance rekindled, calling Elias delusional, demanding his removal. But Clara stood abruptly from the gallery. "Wait," she said, her voice small but cutting through the air. "If what he says is true, Then the story we've all been living is a lie. Elias turned to her, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Miss," he said, "the truth always waits for someone brave enough to write it." Then he looked at the judge, his voice calm but resolute. "And someone strong enough to face it." The tension settled like a storm cloud refusing to move. The judge called for a recess, her voice barely steady, but no one dared leave. Elias remained standing in the aisle, his eyes searching the faces of those who had judged him long ago. "You all think justice wears robes," he said quietly. "But I've seen it sweep floors." The weight of his words anchored the room. Judge Crane gripped the bench, her knuckles white, as fragments of her past decisions began to surface. Names, cases, bribes, whispered through shadows of authority. Cloris' recorder clicked softly in the silence. The truth was no longer buried in files. It breathed among them. Judge Crane finally spoke, her tone fragile yet sharp. "If you are who you say you are, then prove it." Elias reached into his pocket and placed a worn envelope on the bench. Inside lay yellowed documents, affidavits, evidence signatures forged in the night. The prosecutor lunged forward to snatch them, but Elias held firm. "This," he said, "was the verdict you never let the world see." Clara's eyes widened as she glimpsed the names on the papers. Everyone tied to cases that made Hurst's career. The truth wasn't just personal anymore. It was institutional rot. Judge Crane's throat tightened. For the first time in years, she looked afraid of the law she once commanded. The crowd's murmur built into a low roar. The bailiff radioed for order, but even he hesitated when he saw Judge Crane's eyes, haunted by recognition. Elias spoke again, his voice unwavering. "You signed the order that destroyed my life, but you weren't alone." He turned his gaze to Hurst, whose lips curled into an anxious sneer. "You needed a scapegoat to save your career." The prosecutor slammed his palm against the desk, shouting denials, yet the sweat on his temple betrayed the lie. Clara's pen scratched across paper, her mind racing. This was no longer a janitor's confession. It was a courtroom resurrection. Judge Crane ordered everyone to sit. Her voice cracked, but carried authority laced with regret. "Mr. Ward," she said, "if your claim holds truth, this courtroom becomes a witness stand for us all." Elias nodded once. "Then let it." Clara rose hesitantly, asking to record everything. Hurst objected, but the judge allowed it. The young reporter pressed record, her voice trembling as she announced the date and time. For the first time, the courthouse was silent, not in control, but in surrender to truth. Elias stepped closer to the bench, laying out every document, one by one, each a piece of the system's forgotten conscience. As Elias spoke, recounting each falsified signature and coerced testimony, the air turned electric with revelation. Judge Crane's composure shattered. Her eyes filled with tears she fought to hide. "I didn't know," she whispered. But Elias's gaze told her otherwise. "You didn't want to." The prosecutor lunged forward again, shouting that none of this could be proven, but Clara interrupted. "Then let's prove it." She turned her recorder toward Elias. "Tell us everything." The janitor smiled faintly. Not out of victory, but release. "Everything," he said, "begins with the case of Samuel Hayes." The old man in the back flinched. The next name of truth had been spoken. A hush swept through the courtroom as every gaze turned toward Samuel Doc Hayes, the retired teacher whose name had just been called from the shadows of memory. His wrinkled hands trembled as he rose, clutching his hat like a shield. Elias's voice softened. "Doc, tell them what you saw." The old man hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Judge Crane and the prosecutor, fear clouding his eyes. I saw the truth buried," he he stammered. They said it was an accident, but it wasn't. The room leaned in, the air thick with the weight of what had been unspoken for decades. I tried to testify back then, Doc whispered, but someone paid me to disappear. The judge's breath hitched, and Clara's recorder captured the sound. The first crack in a system built on silence. Doc Hayes' words tumbled out like fragile truths long imprisoned. He spoke of a young defendant, a boy framed for theft to protect a councilman's son. Elias had defended the boy, found evidence that proved his innocence, but that same evidence vanished overnight. They told me to forget, Doc said, tears streaking his weathered cheeks. They told me if I spoke again I'd lose my pension. The audience gasped, and the prosecutor's face turned crimson. This is slander, Hearst barked, but Elias raised a hand. Truth doesn't slander, it reveals. Judge Crane sat silent, memories tearing through her composure like shards of glass. The janitor's voice carried over the trembling courtroom. Justice was stolen, but it remembers who took her. Judge Crane leaned forward, voice shaking with both authority and guilt. Mr. Hayes, are you accusing this court of corruption? Doc's answer came without hesitation. No, ma'am. I'm saying it was never a court, just a stage. His words struck like thunder. Hearst stood, demanding that the statement be stricken, but Elias interrupted, his calm tone slicing through the chaos. Let the record show. The witness has nothing left to lose. Clara's pulse quickened. She felt history turning in her hands. The old man looked at Elias and whispered, I thought you'd never come back. Elias nodded. Neither did they. The weight of the truth settled over the room like dust over forgotten graves. As the tension thickened, Judge Crane's hand trembled against the bench. For a fleeting moment, the mask of power fell away, revealing the woman beneath the robe, one who had built her career on silence. Mr. T. Ward, she said, her tone both stern and pleading. Why bring this now? Elias turned toward her, voice soft but piercing. Because I cleaned your courtroom for 20 years and watched innocence get swept away with the dust. The prosecutor tried to interject, but the judge silenced him with a glance, a sign that her certainty had fractured. Then let's finish it, she said quietly. Let every lie be spoken aloud. The audience leaned in. The reckoning had begun. Clara's voice filled the silence. Judge, may I ask something for the record? Crane nodded. Do you remember the boy's name? The judge's lips parted, her eyes distant, as if searching through dust-covered files in her conscience. Jacob Lyle, she whispered. The name hung heavy, echoing through the room. Elias closed his eyes, the ghost of the boy he'd failed flickering behind them. He died 3 years later, Elias said quietly. Prison took what the verdict didn't. The courtroom fell into stunned stillness, grief seeping into its very walls. Clara lowered her recorder slowly, tears streaking her cheeks. For the first time, the judge's face crumbled under the weight of her own verdicts. The air in the courtroom had changed. Laughter and shock were gone, replaced by the dense quiet of truth settling in. Judge Crane removed her glasses and set them down, the gesture small but seismic. We reopen the record, she declared, her voice trembling but resolute. Everything said today will be entered as evidence. The prosecutor erupted in protest, but she silenced him with a glare colder than marble. Elias bowed his head slightly, not in victory but relief. The system that buried him was finally digging itself open. Clara scribbled frantically, realizing this was no longer a story, but a resurrection of justice. In the back, Doc Hayes whispered a prayer, his frail voice carried by the stillness of souls, unburdening themselves at last. Judge Crane called for the clerk to retrieve the archived file, State v. Jacob. When the file arrived, it looked more like a relic than a record, faded, dusty, its edges frayed from decades of avoidance. Crane opened it slowly, and the smell of old paper filled the room like the scent of memory itself. Inside, several pages were missing, but among them lay one torn photograph. A teenage boy smiling shyly beside Elias, back when hope still lived in both their eyes. The courtroom watched as Crane's hands trembled over the image. "We failed him," she murmured, voice cracking. Elias nodded. "We failed justice." Outside, thunder rumbled across the horizon, as if the heavens themselves bore witness. As thunder echoed, Elias stepped toward the bench, placing one final document atop the pile. His own disbarment order. "This was the price of truth," he said softly. Judge Crane scanned it, eyes filling with tears as she recognized her own signature at the bottom. "I signed this," she whispered, horror unraveling her composure. Elias met her gaze, calm but unsparing. "You did, but you can also sign what comes next." The meaning in his words sank deep. Redemption wasn't a gift, it was a debt. Clara's camera clicked once, capturing the frozen moment of a woman staring at the ruins of her own authority. The courtroom was no longer divided by power, but by conscience. Prosecutor Hurst finally snapped, slamming his briefcase shut. "This circus ends now," he barked, stepping toward the bench. "You can't reopen a closed case because some janitor tells a story." Elias didn't move, only looked at him with pity. "I was that case," he said simply. Hurst's rage faltered. Clara rose, confronting him with the evidence she'd already recorded. "You knew," she said. "Your name's on half these documents." Hurst lunged forward, but two bailiffs blocked his path. The courtroom gasped as Judge Crane stood. "Mr. Hurst," she declared, voice resonant with authority and shame, "you are hereby removed from these proceedings, pending review of misconduct." The balance of power shifted. For the first time, the law listened. As the prosecutor was escorted out, the echo of his footsteps vanished into silence. Judge Crane sat back down, shoulders slumped under the weight of decades. "Mr. Ward," she said, "I can't undo the past, but I can bring the truth forward." Elias nodded, his eyes glistening. "Then let the truth speak louder than the laughter that began this day." Clara's recorder clicked off, her hand trembling as she realized history had shifted in front of her. Outside, rain began to fall, soft, cleansing, relentless. Elias turned to Doc Hayes, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did right today," he said. The old man smiled faintly. "Took me long enough." The courtroom felt lighter, as if some ghost had finally been laid to rest. The rain did not stop for 3 days. By the time the courthouse reopened, word had spread across Magnolia County. The janitor had unmasked the law itself. Clara's article headlined every local paper, her words igniting a quiet revolution in a town long taught to stay silent. Now, the same citizens who once laughed at Elias gathered outside the courthouse steps, holding candles against the gray morning. Inside, Judge Crane convened a public hearing to investigate old cases. Elias stood at her side, no longer as a janitor or an outcast, but as a man finally seen. The echoes of mops and laughter were gone. In their place, the slow, steady rhythm of justice finding its pulse again. Clara sat at her cluttered desk in the newsroom, papers strewn across every inch of space, transcripts, statements, letters. Her voice recorder played back fragments of Elias's words, each one a thread in the larger web of corruption that had poisoned the county for decades. She realized it wasn't just one judge or one prosecutor. It was a system built on silence and convenience. Outside her window, the courthouse clock chimed, echoing like a heartbeat calling her back to truth. She began typing, her story no longer about a janitor or a scandal, but about a reckoning the town could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, Judge Crane walked through the courthouse archives alone, Rows of forgotten files towered over her, ghosts bound in paper. She ran her fingers across case folders marked closed, but felt the pulse of injustice inside each one. Every document reminded her of the years she'd traded truth for order. When she found Jacob Lyle's case again, she whispered, "Forgive me." A soft sound broke the silence. Elias had followed her. "The past doesn't forgive," he said gently, "but it can teach." The two stood amid the dust and silence, two broken servants of the same system, finally facing the ruins they'd both helped build. Back in town, Clara's story hit newsstands at dawn. "The janitor who cleaned justice," the headline read. People stopped on sidewalks, coffee cups forgotten in hand. The mayor called for an emergency council meeting. Whispers turned to shouts. In cafes, on porches, in barber shops, people spoke Elias Ward's name with reverence and shame. Doc Hayes sat by his radio, listening to Clara's broadcast with tears of pride. For the first time in decades, the town wasn't laughing. It was listening. And somewhere inside the courthouse, Elias mopped the floor one last time. Not out of duty, but as a benediction to the place where justice had finally awakened. By evening, the courthouse filled once more, not for a trial, but for truth. Judge Crane took the bench beside Elias. The first time two voices shared that seat. "We stand today," she said, "not as judge and defendant, but as witnesses to the cost of silence." Applause rippled softly, humble but powerful. Clara filmed the moment, her lens trembling with emotion. Doc Hayes stood in the aisle, candle in hand, its flames steady despite the draft. Elias looked over the room. The same place that once mocked him now rose in honor. "Justice," he said, voice low and full, "isn't blind. She's just been waiting for someone to open her eyes." Morning light crept through the courthouse windows like cautious forgiveness. The benches were filled again, but this time, not for trial, for truth's reckoning. The state had sent an investigator from the Capitol, a man in a navy suit whose eyes held both suspicion and curiosity. Judge Crane sat upright, her robe freshly pressed but her face bare of pretense. Elias stood beside her, unshackled by the past but burdened with memory. Clara's camera whirred softly from the gallery, capturing history being rewritten by those once buried beneath it. "Mr. Ward," the investigator began, "why come forward now?" Elias took a deep breath. "Because silence became complicity," he said, "and I was done being part of the cleanup crew for lies." The crowd murmured, moved not by spectacle, but by truth, reclaimed in its purest form, unpolished, unafraid, undeniable. The investigator spread out the documents across the prosecution's desk. Forged signatures, sealed testimonies, missing transcripts, each a relic of betrayal. "These could dismantle more than this courthouse," he muttered. Judge Crane met his gaze with a steady calm. "Then let them." Elias leaned forward, voice low but resolute. "The foundation of justice is not what we build, but what we rebuild after corruption." Clara's pen raced. The sound of truth being transcribed filled the silent room. Doc Hayes whispered a prayer of gratitude under his breath. Even the walls seemed to lean closer, hungry to absorb this rare honesty. The investigator finally looked up. "This hearing," he said, "may open a federal inquiry." Elias nodded. "Then justice will finally have her day in court." Outside, crowds gathered again, not in protest or curiosity, but in solidarity. People held signs reading, "Truth never retires, and justice begins here." Clara stepped out during recess to film them, capturing faces of every age, race, and story the town had once ignored. Inside, Judge Crane walked to the defense table where Elias once stood alone. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "your courage taught me more about law than any court ever did. Elias smiled faint. Justice doesn't need a robe, just a pulse. She reached out, and for a moment, their hands met, the weight of forgiveness exchanged without words. The doors opened and the crowd's chants drifted in, not angry, not mocking, but resolute. The sound of a town learning to stand upright. When proceedings resumed, the investigator addressed the room. What began as laughter, he said, has become a lesson in truth. His voice echoed through the vaulted chamber. Elias remained silent, eyes lowered, as he relived 2 decades of ridicule and loss that had led to this moment. Judge Crane stood. Mr. Chair, Ward's reinstatement is beyond this court's power, she said, but not beyond its respect. The crowd rose instinctively, a gesture of collective acknowledgement. Even the investigator nodded, moved, despite himself. Clara lowered her camera, tears bright in her eyes. For the first time, Elias seemed lighter, not redeemed by decree, but by recognition. Justice had not rewritten the past. It had simply refused to hide from it any longer. As dusk fell, the courthouse emptied slowly, leaving behind echoes of the day's awakening. Clara lingered near the steps, her recorder still running, though no one spoke. Elias emerged last, his mop handle resting over his shoulder like an old companion. You going to write all this down? He asked her. She smiled softly. Every word. He looked toward the horizon where the last light bled into the clouds. Then make sure they know, he said. Justice didn't come back. It never left. It just waited for someone to listen. Judge Crane joined them at the top of the steps, her robe fluttering in the evening wind. The 3 stood together, silhouettes against the fading light, truth-tellers at the threshold of renewal. The courthouse behind them glowed like a sanctuary reborn. Morning returned to Magnolia County quiet and clean, as though the rain had washed more than just the streets. The courthouse doors opened without the creak of dread they once held, and people entered not out of fear, but reverence. Elias stood at the center aisle, mop in hand for the last time, watching as sunlight poured through the stained glass and touched every bench, every scarred surface that had witnessed their reckoning. Judge Crane approached him without robe or title, dressed simply, her eyes at peace. They reinstated you, she said softly, holding a letter embossed with the seal of the bar. Elias didn't take it right away. Instead, he looked at her and said, Justice doesn't need permission to exist, Judge. She smiled faintly. No, but it needs men like you to remind her she still can. The weight of years lifted, not by verdict, but by grace. Outside, the town gathered once more, not for trial, but for Thanksgiving. Candles lined the courthouse steps, flickering like living confessions. Clara stood among them, her camera lowered, her eyes lifted to where Elias greeted each person, as if they were old friends. Doc Hayes approached with unsteady steps and handed Elias a folded note. From Jacob's sister, he whispered. She says thank you. Elias read the words, tears catching in his beard, then folded the note into his pocket like a prayer. Judge Crane stood beside him, addressing the crowd with humility instead of authority. Justice is not a place, she said. It's a person who refuses to stay silent. Applause rose softly, not thunderous, just steady, like the heartbeat of a town reborn. Later, inside Clara's newsroom, the clatter of typewriters hummed like a hymn. Her article headline glowed on the front page, "The Day Justice Took a Seat." She leaned back, exhaustion softening into pride. On her desk sat Elias's old courthouse key, the one he'd left behind with a note that read, "Keep it clean." She smiled, realizing the message wasn't about mops or floors, but about truth itself. Behind her, Doc Hayes listened to the printing press roll, the sound steady as rainfall. "You think they'll remember?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Not the laughter," she said, "but what came after." Outside, The sun broke through gray clouds, light spilling across fresh ink and honest words. In the courthouse archive room, Judge Crane replaced Jacob Lyle's file on the shelf, not as evidence but as remembrance. She paused, touching the faded label with reverent fingers. Behind her hung a new plaque, engraved simply, "In memory of the innocent and the forgotten." Elias entered quietly, now wearing a modest suit instead of his gray jumpsuit. "You couldn't have thrown it away," he said softly. Crane shook her head. "Oh, and shook her head. Justice learns by keeping her scars." They stood in silence, surrounded by paper ghosts, until Elias whispered, "Then she'll never forget us." The old walls seemed to breathe again. Not with secrets, but with stories reclaimed. That evening, Elias walked alone through the quiet courthouse halls. The mop closet stood open, empty except for the echo of what had been. He placed his hand on the doorframe, whispering a silent goodbye to the life that had hidden him long enough to prepare him for truth. Outside, the town bells began to ring. Not in mourning, but in gratitude. Clara's voice echoed faintly from the radio somewhere. "Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a robe. Sometimes she carries a mop." Elias smiled, stepping into the twilight. The sound of laughter, not cruel, but honest, drifting through the streets. The courthouse glowed behind him, every window alive with golden light, as though the truth itself had decided to stay a while.